Okay.
Chocolate milk.
This wasn't much. You've already had chocolate milk. This wasn't much of a gather, Peemer decided when he'd done one round of the small nestle of stalls. They didn't even have bubbly pies at the baker's, and the craft halls had obviously sent very junior men to represent them. Still, a gather was a day to be enjoyed, and not many were held at Nabol even when rest days were thread clear, so the Navalese were making as much of the occasion as they could. The wineman was doing a brisk trade by the time Peemer returned that way. He squatted at the corner of the stand, munching slowly away at another meat roll, listening to comments and noticing with deep chagrin and a growing wrath how many fire lizards flitted about, resting for a moment on the stall tops, wheeling up in pairs to dance in the air a bit before settling on their friends' shoulders or on a new position where they could overlook. At first, Peemer tried to convince himself that he was only seeing the same group again and again. He did notice that most were greens with a sprinkling of brown and blues, the lesser fire lizards. When he saw bronzes, they were always on the shoulder or arm of the more prosperously dressed. Yet no matter how Peemer argued the matter in his mind, it was clear that Nabol Hold boasted more fire lizards than he had seen even at Bend and Weir during the impression. Suddenly, a phrase stood out from the murmurous conversation about the wine stand. "There'll be a few more happy holders today, I hear." Peemer turned to scratch his shoulder fiercely and located the man who had spoken from his knowing smirk, a smith from his clothing. His companion, a miner by his shoulder badge, was nodding in comprehension. "Nabol don't take proper care of him, he don't. 3 never shelled. My master is fair upset about that. Means to have 3 more today or his name's not Caljan." "Is that so?" The smith bobbed his head up and down to show regret. "We'd one that didn't hatch too, but no joy did we get above. Eggs we was promised and eggs we was given. Up to us to care for 'em proper enough to make 'em hatch. That one," and he jerked his head toward the cold cliff to indicate Lord Moran, "enjoys putting a snake among the wherries." He snorted derisively. "Happens it's its only pleasure now." Both men guffawed with malicious delight. "Happen we'll not need to worry about him much longer, I hear tell." The smith winked broadly at the miner. "Couldn't be soon enough for me. We'll see you at the dancing? Going so soon? Had my glass. Must get back." The disappointment in the miner's face made Peemer think that the smith's departure was precipitous. Going to tell his master about the eggs that were up at the hold, was he? Peemer decided to tag along. Eggs handed out in quantities. Eggs that had been badly handled and wouldn't hatch, unless... And Peemer reflected over something that Manoli had said about fire lizard eggs. Green fire lizards laid eggs as well, having been fertilized by a mating flight with a blue or brown, sometimes even a bronze. But green fire lizards were stupid. They'd lay a clutch, 10 at the most, Manoli said, and leave them with such a shallow covering of beach sand that they were easy prey to wild wherries or sand snakes. Very few green-laid clutches survived to hatch, which, as Manoli had succinctly stated, was just as well, or Pern would be up to the eyeballs in little green fire lizards. Peemer wondered if anyone in Nabol realized that a deception was being practiced on them, and green fire lizard eggs were what were being dispersed so lavishly. Then he realized that he'd lost sight of the smith, and, cursing his inattentiveness, began to retrace his steps, turning with assumed idleness to peer between the stalls. He spotted the smith, urgently speaking to a man with a smith master's badge, and as the man reacted to his journeyman's excited words, his master's chain sparkled. Peemer managed to duck away as both men suddenly turned toward him. When they had passed him on their way to the hold, Peemer followed, restlessly scanning faces in the hopes that he might see Sibel and tell him what he'd overheard. Can you not do that right in my ear? Thanks. You can come back over when you're done. I just don't want to hear you crunch on that. Sibel might wish to investigate. As the two smiths turned from the gather area toward the hold, Peemer had to pause or be noticeable. The smiths strode purposefully up the ramp toward the main hold gates. They were challenged by the guard, and after some moments of arguing, the guard summoned another from the gatehouse and sent him to the hold with the smith master's message. While the messenger was gone, 2 men emerged from the hold, well wrapped in their cloaks, though the air had lost its chill. Something about the way they walked, carefully, the way they carried their heads proudly, the way they nodded and smiled at the guards smugly, and most of all, the way they pointedly avoided contact, struck Peemer as significant. He continued to watch them as they turned toward the gather meadow. As they approached him, he caught sight of their figures in profile, and realized that each man carried something hidden in his cloak, held tight against his side. It couldn't have been a large object, but, thought Peemer, putting expression, manner, and profile together, an egg pot wouldn't be large. He wanted to follow the men to see if his suspicion was correct, but he also didn't want to leave the hold until the message from the Smith-master had been answered. A new party, holders by the look of them, now made themselves known to the guards and were admitted, to the angry chagrin of the Smith-master. Then 3 carts, heavily laden to judge by the straining of the burden beast juggling up the ramp, forced the Smith-master to one side. The guard waved the carts toward the kitchen courtyard. The last cart jammed a wheel against the ramp parapet, the driver thudding his stick against the burden beast's rump. "Wheel be jammed!" yelled Peemer, not liking to see any animal beaten for what was not its fault. He jumped forward to help guide the carter. The man now backed his stolid beast, swinging its head left. Peemer, setting his shoulder to the tailgate, gave a push in the proper direction. He also tried to peek under the covering to see what on earth was being delivered to the hold on a gather day when most business was being done in the gather meadow. Before he could get a good look, the cart had picked up speed as it reached more level ground. He was past the guards, arguing with the smith and paying no more attention to the procession of the carts. Ducking quickly to the side of the cart away from the carter, Peemer gained access to the hold proper. As the carts rumbled on into the kitchen court, Peemer rapidly wondered how he could turn this opportunity to advantage and remain in the hold after the carters had unloaded and left. Certainly, if he was actually in the hold, he might find out more than he could possibly learn wandering about the gather. If nothing else, he could discover what the carter had delivered. Then he spied a line of coveralls bleaching in the spring sun. He darted over and removed one, ignoring the slight dampness as he slipped it over his head. Kitchen drudges were never noted for cleanliness, and once the beast's dirt and stains on his tunic recovered, the dust on his boots and trousers would be unremarkable. "Hey, you!" Peemer tried to ignore the call, but it was repeated and could only be directed to him. He turned toward the speaker, affecting a stupid expression. "I mean you with the empty arms." Obediently, he trudged back to the carter, who slung a heavy sack across his back. At that point, the kitchen steward bustled out to supervise, and Peemer, bent double under the sack, passed him without a glance. The steward alternated between chivying his drudges out to help unload and the carter for his ill-timed arrival. The carter replied with equal heat that he had heavy carts and slow beasts, and had had to give way and eat dust from those hurrying to this bloody gather. Moran ought to be pleased he'd got here within the day allotted, much less at an earlier hour. The steward hushed him and began shouting orders, ordering Peemer on to the back stores room. Peemer got inside the kitchen, not knowing where the stores rooms were, so, making a business of wiping his face and easing his shoulders, he waited until someone brushed past him and turned down the proper corridor. "Don't know where I'm to put more, this is plenty here already," muttered the drudge as Peemer followed him. "Top them others," suggested Peemer helpfully. In the dim light of waning glows, the Nabalese peered at Peemer. "Never saw you afore." "Nor you haven't," Peemer agreed amiably. "Sent from town to help a kitchen for together." "Oh." And the sly gleam in the man's eyes suggested to Peemer that he had just let himself in for the worst and dirtiest of the chores about a hole on a gather day, when the Lord was feasting guests. Haste appeared the vital factor in unloading the carts, so Peemer didn't see many of the seals on the sacks, barrels, and boxes he humped out of sight. But he saw enough to realize that the delivery came from a variety of sources. Tanner, weaver, smithcraft for the heaviest boxes, wine from many of the yards, but none, he was pleased to note, from Bendon. When the last bundle was stowed in the now bulging stores room, Peemer's sigh of relief was echoed by Bessel, the sly drudge, who had managed to stay close to him during the unloading. Peemer had no sooner lowered himself to a sack to rest than the man snatched him to his feet. "Come on, we've no time to rest today." Nor did Peemer, who was set first to scrape out ashes from the secondary hearth, and then to gutting beasts and wild fowl, thankful that he'd watched Camo often enough at that task to know the tricks. He scoured extra plates, encrusted with the dirt and grime of turns, until his fingers shriveled. When he'd done that and peeled a dragon load of tubers, he was allowed a breather so long as he kept one of the 5 spits turning. Chaos broke loose when the hold steward arrived to inform the kitchen that Lord Moran chose to eat in his own quarters, and these were to be prepared while he walked the gather. The kitchen steward obsequiously took the change of order, having only that hour completed the feast arrangements in the great hall. The moment the heavy door had swung shut on the hold steward's back, however, he burst into obscenities that won him Peemer's startled approval. If Peemer had thought he'd worked hard before, he was soon disabused of that notion by the rate at which he was sent flying about the kitchen to collect cleaning and polishing tools and preparations. Then he was sent on ahead with Bessel and a woman to start cleaning the Lord's rooms. Already weary from an early rising, and more hard labor than he'd known since his native codhold, Peemer tried to cheer himself by imagining Master Oldie's reaction to his quiet day at Nabul Gather. "Who'd have thought he'd walk together?" the woman was saying as they trudged up the steep steps from the main hall to Moran's apartment. "Had to. Didn't you hear what they're saying at the gather? Moran dead already and none know his heir. Some is want to turn gather day into duel day." That remark set both Nabbalese into cackles of laughter, and Peemer wondered if he could be ignorant enough of hold problems to ask why they were so amused. "I saw 'em coming in, I did," said Bessel, again with that sly, knowing expression on his face. "Every one of 'em was with him sometime today, they was. Outside's with him now, shouldn't wonder. He'll have his little game with him, he will, each thinking he's been named," said the woman, and dug her elbow into Bessel's ribs, which sent them both off into malicious laughter again. "Hope it's not just us that has to do all the cleaning here," Bessel said, putting his hand on the door handle. "Hasn't been done it." He turned his head away, coughing against the stench that wafted out to them from the open door. As the smell reached Peemer's nostrils, sweet, cloying, sickening, he felt his stomach turn in protest and tried not to inhale. He hung back, hoping the fresher air of the corridor would cleanse the room of its stink. "Here, you get in and open shutters.
Can I use this?
You're used to stinking messes, gutting man." "No, it'll bleed through whatever you're going to draw on. You need markers that won't bleed through. They're right there, babe." Bessel grabbed Peemer roughly by the arm and propelled him Nope, the other ones.
Which ones?
Right next to him, on the, nope, other cubicle, other box.
This?
Sweetheart, to your right. Over there.
These ones.
Yes, those ones. Pull out the whole black bag. Sorry, we gotta find the right markers. It's very important. There you go. Okay. Bessel grabbed Peemer roughly by the arm and propelled him violently into the room. How Peemer managed not to vomit from the odor of the room before he reached the shutters and flung them open, he didn't know. He half threw his body up the deep sill, gasping in fresh, cool air. "Other windows too, boy," ordered Bessel from the doorway. Peemer filled his lungs and opened the other windows, staying by the last until the chill air dissipated the odors of decay and illness. And Lord Moran's heirs had to attend him in this funking atmosphere? Peemer spared them a moment of sympathy. Then Bessel shouted for him to go into the other rooms and open them up to air properly. "Else no one eat his food like as not, and we're 'em to clean up their messes." The foul odor hung heaviest in the last of the 4 large rooms that comprised the Lord Holder's private apartments in Nabul. It was then that Peemer blessed the happenstance that had sent him in here ahead of the others. Reposing on the hearth were 9 pots of exactly the size in which fire lizard eggs were placed to keep warm and harden. Mastering his urge to gag, Peemer ducked across the room to investigate. One pot was set slightly apart from the others, and lifting the lid, Peemer scraped enough sand away to see the mottled shell before he covered it carefully over. He took a quick look at the contents of the first pot in the other group. Yes, the egg was smaller and of a different hue. He'd wager every mark he owned that the separate pot contained a fire lizard queen egg. Quickly he switched pots, shielding his actions with his body in case Bessel ventured this far to check on him. He dumped the sand with deft speed into the cinder shovel, removed the egg and shoved it up under his coverall and into his shirt above his belt. Poking among the cinders, he selected one that had a slightly rounded end and neatly inserted it into the egg pot, replaced sand and lid,
what's he doing right now?
and stood the rifled
He's
pot
stealing an
back
egg.
in line, straightening up just as the woman crossed the threshold. "That's a lad. Tend the fire first, and you'll need to bring up more black rock from the yard. He likes his warmth, he does." She cackled again as she roughly pushed carving chairs out of her way to sweep under the work table. "To be sure, he'll feel the cold soon enough, Why did he steal a fire lizard egg?
Yeah.
Why do you think? You think about that.
Oh, right, he wanted.
Bessel joined in her laughter. The fire was hot as Pemer shook the grate free of ashes, and his face burned by the time he'd cleared the debris. The heat also warmed the egg, lying up against his ribs. "Hurry it up, you guttin' man," said Bessel when Pemer began to lug the heavy ash bucket out. "No slouching, or take my hand to you." He raised a big fist and Pemer ducked away, feeling the egg pinch his skin and worried he might crack it prematurely. As he strained with the heavy bucket down the long steps, he wondered however he was going to keep the egg safe. Certainly not on his person, and he'd have to keep it warm too, as well as in some place to which, in his guise as a lonely guttingman, he'd have easy access. The solution came to him just as he was about to dump the ashes. He checked the swing of the bucket and glanced about the ash pit. Then, very carefully, he emptied the ashes in a pile just to the left of the ash pit opening. Anyone emptying ash buckets tended to fling the contents to the back wall, where the cinders spread downward from the top of the accumulated pile. The molding on either side of the opening kept ashes from tumbling back into the courtyard until the pit was full. Its capacity was by no means reached at this moment. With his booted toe, Pemer made a small depression in the warm ashes, quickly inserted the egg, covering it first with warm ashes, then with a coating of cold cinders to insulate it. Glancing at the sun as he filled his bucket with fresh blackstone from the dump next to the ash pit, Pemer saw that the sun was lowering, which was a mercy, he thought, lugging the blackstone back into the hold, because he wondered if he'd managed to laugh through the most arduous day of his life. They'd have the feast soon, more than likely as soon as Lord Moran returned to his freshened quarters. What caused that noxious stink? Certainly not Master Oldive's medicines, for the healer believed in fresh air and freshening herbs, which at their worst were pungent, but could not cause the odor in Lord Moran's rooms. No matter. Once the Lord and his guests were served, the drudges would get what remained on the serving platters, and that would mean everyone could relax for a while. He could perhaps sneak away then, before Sibel got anxious. And did he have a lot to tell Sibel? Half the workers in the hold were now running up and down the steps, pursued by the strident voice of the hold steward who had arrived to direct the freshening. Pemer was promptly given another ash bucket to empty and fill with black rock. On his way back through the kitchen this time, he sneaked a bread roll, which hardened him considerably. By some miracle, they were just about finished when a messenger arrived from the guard to say that Lord Moran and his guests were returning. The steward shoved and pushed everyone out, even to the point of collecting abandoned cleaning tools. As the last of the drudges scurried back to the kitchen, the laughter of the returning gatherers was heard at the hold doors. Pemer had to assist the cook turn the roast for carving, and nearly had his finger sliced thinner when the cook caught him taking bits that dropped to the table. Then he had to mash endless kettles of tubers. As fast as a dish was served up and garnished, it was dispatched above. At one point, Pemer thought he might be sent, but it was decided he was much too dirty to carry food. Instead, he was sent to the bowels of the hold for more glow baskets, as Lord Moran complained that he couldn't see to eat. Noob. Hold on. Pemer had to make 3 trips to satisfy the need. By that time, the platters were coming back to the kitchen. The drudges and lesser stewards stripped food off as it passed them by. The kitchen began to quiet as mouths were stuffed too full to permit speech. Pemer managed to secure a meat-rend bone, and grabbing a handful of the sliced bread, he retired to the darkest corner of the huge room to eat. He applied himself ravenously to his food, having decided to leave as quickly as possible now. The sun had set during the furor of serving the feast, so he had the cover of darkness to retrieve his egg. And he'd have the excuse for the guards if they stopped him, that he was finished with his duties. Lord Grohe always gave his drudges time to attend the gather dancing. Pemer was looking forward to encountering Sibel again. He might not have heard much to the point of which air the howled staff preferred, but he had proof that Lord Moran was getting far more fire lizard eggs than a small hold like Nabol ought to receive, that his storerooms were full of more supplies than he and his could ever use in a full pass, much less a turn. Hungry though he was, Pemer couldn't finish all the meat on the bone. He was too tired to eat, he thought, and before he did collapse from exhaustion, he'd better retrieve the egg and slip out to meet Sibel. How he longed for his bed at the Harper Hall. The regular kitchen drudges were too busy grumbling about the poor selection left for them to eat and how much those blinking guests were eating and drinking to notice Peemer's daft exit. He took possession of the precious egg, warm to the touch, and wrapping it carefully in a wad of rags, thrust the bundle once again under his tunic. He jauntily approached the main gates, whistling deliberately off-key. "And where do you think you're going?" "To gather," Peemer replied, as if this was all too obvious. He was as surprised by the man's guffaw as he was by being swung around and roughly propelled back the way he had come. "Don't try that one on me again, gutting man," called the guard, as the force of his push sent Peemer stumbling across the cobbles, trying not to fall and damage the egg. He stopped in the darkest shadow of the wall and stood fuming over this unexpected check to his escape. It was ridiculous. He couldn't think of any other hold in all Pern where the drudges were denied the privilege of going to the hold's own gather. "Go on back to the ashes, gutting man." It was then that Peemer realized his coverall, none too clean in the light, was still visible in the shadows, so he slunk past the opening into the kitchen court. Out of sight, he stripped off the betraying coverall and flung it into the corner. So he wasn't allowed to leave, was he? Well, the guests would have to be passed. He would simply bide his time and slip out of Nabole Hole the same way he'd gotten in. Taking heart in that notion, he looked about him for a suitable place to wait. He should remain in the courtyards where he would hear the commotion of leave-taking. He'd better not return to the kitchens, or he'd be put to work again. His roving eye caught the blackness that was the ash and blackstone pits, and that solved his problem. Keeping to the shadows, he made his way to this least likely of all hiding spots and settled on the spongy surface at the right-hand side of the opening to the ash pit. Not the most comfortable place to wait, he thought, removing a large cinder shell from under his tailbone before he achieved some measure of comfort. The night wind had picked up a bit, and he felt the chill when he poked his nose over the coping. Ah, well, he shouldn't have long to wait. He doubted anyone would tolerate Lord Moran's smell longer than absolutely necessary. He was awakened from a fitful doze by the sound of shouting and much running about in the main courtyard, and then a nearer, more frightening clamor in the kitchen itself. Above the shouts and slammings, he heard a pathetic wail. "I don't know him, I tell you! First time today I saw him. Said he was here to help to gather, and we needed help." Trust Bessel to clear himself of any blame, thought Peemer. "Sir, gate guard says a boy answering his description tried to pass out to the gather a while back. He couldn't say if the drudge carried anything about him. Wasn't looking for stolen items." "Then he didn't leave?" The voice was a snarl of fury. Lord Moran, wondered Peemer, and then realized the unexpected had happened. The substitute in the egg pot had been discovered. There'd be no way he could creep out of this hold in the shadow of departing guests. With the way men were dashing about, lighting up every crook and corner of the courtyards, he'd be lucky to remain undiscovered. Some eager soul would certainly think to prod a spear through the ash pit just on the off chance, especially if Bessel remembered that he'd emptied ash buckets and might have hidden the egg there. Frantic now, Peemer glanced up at the walls about him. Carved from the cliff itself they were, and he could never climb straight up unseen. He caught sight of a rectangular darkness just above his head to the left of the ash pit. A window? To what? This side of the kitchen was devoted to storerooms, but what window? The storerooms were backed from the corridor side. No searcher would believe him able to open locked doors without a key, which the kitchen steward kept on a chain about his waist at all times. He couldn't ask for a safer hiding place, and if he closed the window behind him, he had to wait until the kitchen courtyard had been thoroughly searched, except for the garbage and ash pits. The shout went up that the thief must be hiding in the hold. The searcher swarmed back inside, and he leapt to the top of the ash pit wall. His fingers just reached the ledge of the window. Taking a deep breath, Peemer gave a wriggling jump and succeeded in planting both hands over the sill. It took every sinew in his body to secure that awkward and painful grip. He felt as if he'd scraped the skin from all his fingers as he clung and worked his body up until his elbows had purchased on the sill. With another mighty wriggle and kick, he managed to propel himself up and over, falling on his head on the topmost sack. Groaning at the pain of that contact, he twisted about and, reaching up, drew the shutter tightly but quietly across, barring the window. Then he felt the egg to be sure his fall had done it no harm. He tried to imagine this room from the perspective of the door side, but all the storerooms had seemed the same. He crouched in terror as he heard shouting in the corridor. Someone rattled the bolts of the door. Locked tight, and the steward has the keys. He can't be here. They might just take a look, thought Peemer, when they didn't find him anywhere else. He crawled cautiously over the stacked bundles until he found one with enough slack at the top to admit him. He opened the thong, and just as he was crawling in, wondered how under the sun he was going to tie it up again. The stitching at the side began to give in his hand. Smiling happily at such a solution, he rapidly undid the stitching down the side. Crawling out, he redid the knot about the mouth of the sack, then slid through the undone seam, which once inside he could do up, slowly, but enough to pass a cursory inspection. It was hard to do, feeding the thick thread through the original holes from the inside, and his hands and fingers were cramped when he finally accomplished the feat. He was in a sack of cloth bales, and despite the cramped confines, he was able to wiggle down between bolts so that he was standing on the bottom of the sack, and both he and the egg were cushioned on all sides by the material. Between fatigue and the scant supply of air in the sack, he found his eyes drooping, and surrendering to the combination of exhaustion and safety, he fell fast asleep. He was roused briefly when the door was unlocked and thrown open, but the inspection was cursory, since the hold steward kept insisting that the doors had been locked since the morning, and he wouldn't let them poke any spears lest they harm the contents of the bales. He could have hid in the glow room. He was sent there several times. The door was duly shut and locked. Pemer was conscious of more activity, but his sleep was so deep that he wasn't certain later whether he dreamed the noise or not. He wasn't even conscious of being moved, or of the cold of between. What woke him was a strange difficulty with breathing, a sense of heat, and the terror of suffocating in his own sweat. Gasping, he tore at the thread he had reworked, hard to undo with moist, trembling hands that had no strength, and with sight impeded by perspiration pouring down his forehead. Even when he had forced a small hole in the sack, he still couldn't seem to breathe. Weeping in terror, even to the point of forgetting the egg that had brought him to this extremity, he squirmed out of the sack to discover himself in a small space among other sacks. The heat was unbearable, but caution returned, and he listened for any sounds. Instead of noise, his senses reported sun-heated material and hides, sun-warmed metal, and the sour sweat of hot wine. He tried to shove the nearest sack away from him and couldn't shift it. Feeling the contents, he realized that it was metal. Twisting around, he tested the sack above him and gave an experimental heave. It moved, and a whoosh of slightly cooler air rewarded his efforts. Dragging breath into his lungs, he waited until his heart stopped its frantic pounding. And then, belatedly remembering the egg, he felt the rags about the precious burden. It seemed to be whole, but he didn't have sufficient space to get it out and look. He gave another shove at the upper bale with no success. Angling so that his shoulders were against the unyielding metal, he levered his feet and pushed as hard as he could. It moved farther, and he saw a crack of sky so brilliantly blue that he gasped at the color. It was then that he realized he wasn't in Nibble Hold any longer, that the heat was not due to the unventilated storerooms beyond Lord Ron's kitchen, but the sun pouring down from the southern skies. Once he was able to breathe easily, Pemer became aware of other discomforts: parched mouth and throat, a stomach gnawing with emptiness, and a head that banged with a distressingly keen ache. He repositioned himself and shoved the sack a little further to one side. Then he had to rest, panting with the exertion as sweat trickled down inside his clothes. He had made enough space to take a look at the egg, and he fumbled under his tunic for it with trembling hands. It was warm to his touch, almost hot, and he worried that an egg could be overheated. What had Manoli said about the temperature required by hatching eggs? Surely beach sands under the sun were hotter than his body. He could see no fracture marks on the shell and fancied he felt a faint throbbing. Probably his own blood. He squinted at the blue sky, which meant freedom, and decided not to put the egg back in his tunic. If he held it in front of him, then it didn't matter how he twisted and squeezed his body past the sacks and bales. The egg would take no harm, and there was no way it could fall far. When he was breathing more easily, he gathered his body, egg holding hand above his head, and began to squirm upwards. Just as he thought he was free, the sack behind him settled agonizingly on his left foot, and he had to put down the egg to free himself. Bruised, torn in muscle, skin, and nerve, Pemer slowly dragged himself out of the carelessly piled goods.
Pemer, what have you gotten yourself into again?
He laid stretched flat, mindful that he might be visible. The unshielded sun baked his dehydrated and exhausted body as he listened beyond the pounding of his heart and the thudding of blood through his veins. But he heard only the distant sound of voices raised in laughing conversation. He could smell salt in the air and the odd aroma of something sweet and perhaps overripe. His tired mind could not recall much of what he'd heard of the southern weir. Vague flashes of people saying you could pick fresh fruit right off the trees reassured him. A breeze fanned his face, bringing with it the smell of baking meats. Hunger asserted itself. He licked his dried, cracking lips and winced as the salt of his sweat settled painfully in the cuts. Cautiously, he raised his head and realized that he was at the top of a considerable mound that was braced against the stone walls of a structure of some height. To one side there was an open space, to the other the crushed green of leaves and fronds, half trapped by the bales. He inched himself cautiously toward the foliage, the egg considered at each movement. But even with caution, his heart all but stopped when his motion caused one of the bundles to settle abruptly, with what seemed to him a lot of unnecessary noise. He listened intently for a long moment before continuing his crawl toward the foliage. Now, if he could climb up that tree... One look at the horny bark decided him against that. His hands were sore, scratched and bleeding from past efforts. He was about